The world is not fair. And the sooner you accept this brutal truth, the faster you'll understand why some people control every conversation, every negotiation, every conflict, while others scramble to fill every silence with desperate words. Right now, while you're reading this, someone less articulate than you is winning negotiations you would lose. Someone less intelligent than you is dominating conversations where you would be ignored. Someone less qualified than you is controlling social dynamics that leave you feeling powerless. And you want to know why. Because they've mastered something you're terrified of. Silence. Not the awkward silence of someone who has nothing to say. The strategic silence of someone who understands that power flows to those who control when to speak and when to withhold. They've weaponized the one thing most people fear more than confrontation itself: the absence of words. Every time you rush to fill silence, you're bleeding power. Every time you over-explain your position, you're surrendering control. Every time you keep talking when you should stop, you're handing ammunition to your opponent. Every time you can't tolerate the discomfort of strategic silence, you're announcing to everyone that you're psychologically weak, emotionally reactive, and strategically incompetent. Here's what they don't tell you. In negotiations, the first person to speak after a proposal loses. In conflicts, the person who can't handle silence reveals their hand. In social situations, the one who fills every void with words is seen as desperate, anxious, and low status. Silence isn't empty space that needs filling. It's psychological pressure that separates the dominant from the submissive. Right now, you're probably talking too much, explaining too much, revealing too much, defending too much, justifying too much. And that verbal diarrhea is destroying your power in every interaction you enter. Because while you're busy filling silence with words, strategic people are using silence to read you, manipulate you, and control you. And the worst part, you probably don't even realize it's happening. You think silence is uncomfortable, so you fill it. You think explaining yourself makes you understood, so you over-explain. You think talking shows engagement, so you never shut up. But in reality, every unnecessary word you speak is a transfer of power from you to whoever has the discipline to remain silent. Machiavelli lived in Renaissance Italy, where princes negotiated treaties, formed alliances, and eliminated enemies. He watched verbose leaders talk themselves into traps, while silent strategists controlled outcomes without saying a word. And he understood a truth that separates the psychologically dominant from the psychologically dominated. Those who control silence control power. Those who fear silence surrender it. This isn't about being quiet because you're timid. This is about weaponizing silence because you're strategic. This is about understanding that in psychological warfare, which is what every negotiation, conflict, and social interaction truly is, silence is the most powerful weapon that exists. And if you don't learn to wield it, you'll spend your entire life being controlled by those who do. Now, I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I refuse to be psychologically dominated by others. The strategic psychology of silence Machiavelli understood this 500 years ago. In a world where everyone competed to be heard, the ones who won weren't the loudest or the most eloquent. They were the most strategic. They understood that words create vulnerability, that silence creates mystery, that the absence of response is often more powerful than any response you could give. So they spoke when it served them and remained silent when it gave them advantage. And in doing so, they controlled every dynamic they entered. 1. Silence forces others to reveal their position. First, let's start with the most ruthless truth in negotiation psychology. Whoever speaks first reveals their position. Whoever stays silent forces the other person to show their cards. You can be the less powerful party in any negotiation, less money, fewer options, weaker position. But if you master strategic silence, you can flip the entire dynamic in your favor, not through persuasion, through psychological pressure. Here's what happens when you stay silent in a negotiation. The other person makes an offer. Instead of responding immediately, accepting, rejecting, or counter-offering, you say nothing. You just look at them. Hold eye contact. Let the silence expand. And watch what happens. They start talking again. They justify their offer. They negotiate against themselves. They reveal information they didn't plan to share. They weaken their own position trying to fill the void your silence created. Most people think negotiation is about making the best argument. It's not. It's about making the other person uncomfortable enough to give you information and concessions without you having to ask. And nothing creates discomfort faster than strategic silence after they've laid out their position. Think about salary negotiations. The hiring manager offers a number. The amateur immediately responds, "That sounds fair," or "I was hoping for more," or launches into justification for why they deserve different. The strategist does something different. They pause. They let silence hang. They make the hiring manager sit with their own offer in uncomfortable silence. And often, without any words from the candidate, the hiring manager starts talking again. "Well, there might be some flexibility." Or we could also add, they negotiate against themselves because humans can't tolerate silence after they've made a proposal. Machiavelli once said, "The wise man does at once what the fool does finally." And fools respond immediately to every proposal. They feel obligated to fill silence. They think immediate response shows engagement. Wise people understand that strategic silence after a proposal does something words never could. It creates psychological pressure that forces the other party to reveal more than they intended. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to admit. Every word you speak in negotiation is potential ammunition against you. Every explanation reveals your priorities. Every justification shows your insecurities. Every immediate response eliminates the psychological pressure that silence creates. When you stay silent, you force others to do your work for you. They explain, they justify, they reveal, they weaken, and you gain power without saying a word. Think about business deals. Two parties at the table. One lays out terms. The strategic one doesn't immediately counter or accept. They lean back. They maintain eye contact. They let silence do the work. And the person who just spoke starts feeling the pressure. "What are you thinking?" they ask. "Is that acceptable?" They probe. "We might be able to adjust," they offer. All because the strategic party understood that silence is pressure, and pressure forces revelation. Most people break silence because they think it makes them look uncertain or weak. The opposite is true. Breaking silence prematurely makes you look anxious and desperate. Maintaining strategic silence makes you look confident and in control, because only someone with options, with power, with leverage can afford to sit comfortably in silence while others squirm. Listen to that again. Let that sink in. In negotiations, silence isn't the absence of power. It's the ultimate expression of it. The first person to speak after a proposal reveals who needs the deal more, and whoever needs it more has less power. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I control my focus. 2. Strategic silence exposes lies and inconsistencies. Pay attention to this because it's one of the most powerful interrogation techniques that exists, and it works just as well in everyday conflicts. When someone is lying to you, when someone is hiding something, when someone's story doesn't add up, silence is your lie detector. Not because silence reveals truth directly, but because liars can't tolerate silence. They fill it with more lies, more details, more explanations that expose the inconsistencies. Here's what happens when you use strategic silence with someone who's being dishonest. They tell you their story. Instead of immediately questioning them, instead of pointing out inconsistencies, instead of arguing, you just look at them. You stay silent. You let the pause expand and watch what happens. They start talking again. They add unnecessary details. They over-explain. They justify what you didn't question. And in doing so, they reveal the lie. Truth is comfortable with silence. Lies need constant reinforcement. When someone tells you the truth, they can say it once and then stop. They don't need to fill silence because truth doesn't require elaborate defense. But when someone lies, silence becomes unbearable. They interpret your silence as skepticism, which makes them defensive. So they keep talking, adding details, contradicting earlier statements, revealing information that exposes the deception. Think about a partner who's hiding something. You ask a simple question. They give an answer. Instead of accepting it or interrogating it, you just look at them silently. If they're telling the truth, they'll be comfortable with your silence. Maybe they'll ask what, or do you not believe me? But they won't keep talking unless you prompt them. If they're lying, they can't handle the silence. They'll start elaborating. And also, plus, let me explain. They'll give you 5 more details you never asked for, and those details will contain the inconsistencies that prove they're lying. Machiavelli understood this. Men are so simple and obedient to present necessities that he who deceives will always find someone who will let himself be deceived. But those who deceive rely on you responding, reacting, engaging. When you stay silent, you remove their ability to manipulate through conversation. You force them to fill the void with their own words. And those words become the rope they hang themselves with. Most people try to catch lies through interrogation. They ask follow-up questions. They point out inconsistencies. They argue. And in doing so, they give the liar opportunities to adjust their story, to explain away problems, to redirect. Strategic silence does the opposite. It gives the liar nothing to work with except their own discomfort. And that discomfort forces them to talk themselves into contradictions. Here's the ruthless truth. Innocent people are comfortable with silence after they've told the truth. Guilty people panic in silence because they're waiting for your reaction to know if you believed them. When you withhold that reaction through silence, they assume you're skeptical. So they start selling harder, explaining more, adding details. And those additional unsolicited details are where the truth reveals itself. When someone's story doesn't add up and you stay silent instead of confronting them immediately, when someone's excuse seems questionable and you just look at them without responding, when someone's explanation raises questions but you let silence do the work. You create psychological pressure that forces truth to surface without you having to extract it through confrontation. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I choose clarity over arrogance. 3. Silence establishes dominance in conflict. Here's something that will transform how you handle confrontation. In any conflict, whoever can tolerate silence holds the power. When someone attacks you verbally, when someone tries to provoke you, when someone attempts to pull you into their emotional chaos, your silence is your shield and your weapon. Not because silence means agreement, because silence means you're psychologically stronger than their attempt to control you through emotional manipulation. Here's what happens when you respond to every attack, every provocation, every emotional manipulation. You validate it. You show that their words have power over you. You enter a battle where victory is impossible because the goal isn't resolution. It's draining your energy through endless verbal warfare. Every response you give is evidence that they control your emotional state. Every justification you offer is proof that you're on the defensive. Think about someone trying to start an argument with you. They make an accusation. They throw an insult. They try to bait you. The psychologically weak person responds immediately. They defend themselves. They counterattack. They get pulled into the emotional warfare. And by responding, they've already lost. Because the person who initiates conflict controls it, unless you refuse to play the game through strategic silence. When you stay silent in response to provocation, you do something psychologically devastating to the aggressor. You demonstrate that their attack doesn't warrant a response, that their emotional manipulation doesn't affect you, that you're so far above their tactics that engaging would be beneath you. Your silence communicates more contempt, more strength, more psychological dominance than any clever comeback ever could. Machiavelli once said, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." And in conflict, strategic silence creates the kind of fear that commands respect. Not fear of violence. Fear that you're untouchable, that their weapons don't work on you, that no amount of provocation will pull you into their chaos. And that realization, that they can't control you through emotional manipulation, breaks their power completely. Most people think responding to attacks shows strength. It doesn't. It shows that you're emotionally reactive and easily controlled. True strength is the ability to sit in silence while someone attempts to provoke you, watching their escalating desperation as they realize their tactics aren't working. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you respond to provocation, you give the provocateur exactly what they want. Your emotional energy, your time, your attention, your loss of composure. When you remain strategically silent, you deny them all of it. And that denial is more psychologically damaging to them than any counterattack you could launch. When someone insults you and you just look at them silently without defending yourself. When someone tries to start an argument and you refuse to engage verbally. When someone attempts emotional manipulation and you remain unmoved and silent, you demonstrate a level of psychological control that terrifies people who rely on emotional chaos as their weapon. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I refuse to be psychologically dominated. 4. Silence creates uncomfortable space that demands filling. Pay attention to this psychological principle because it explains why silence is so powerful across all contexts. Human beings are hardwired to interpret silence as danger. In our evolutionary past, sudden silence meant predators, threat, danger. That ancient programming still exists. When silence extends beyond what's socially comfortable, people experience psychological discomfort so intense they'll do almost anything to relieve it, including giving you exactly what you want. Here's what happens in any social situation where you refuse to fill silence. After someone speaks, there's an expected rhythm to conversation. Response should come within 2 to 3 seconds. When you deliberately extend that silence to 5, 10, 15 seconds, something psychological happens. The other person starts experiencing discomfort. They interpret your silence as judgment, disapproval, or strategic withholding. And that interpretation makes them desperate to resolve the tension. Think about sales. The customer asks about price. The salesperson states it and then, instead of immediately launching into justification or value propositions, stays silent. The customer sits with the number. The silence extends. It becomes uncomfortable, and often, without any additional persuasion, the customer starts talking themselves into the purchase. I suppose that's reasonable for the quality. Or, I was planning to spend around that anyway. They convinced themselves because the silence created psychological pressure that demanded resolution. In social situations, the person who can sit comfortably in silence while others squirm holds all the power. When someone says something inappropriate and you respond with extended silence instead of awkward laughter or polite redirection. When someone makes a demand and you just look at them silently instead of immediately agreeing or refusing. When someone asks for something unreasonable and you let silence be your initial response. You create pressure that forces them to reconsider, backtrack, or negotiate against themselves. Machiavelli understood that everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. And when you're comfortable with silence, you appear psychologically dominant, strategically sophisticated, and emotionally controlled. Most people experience discomfort and interpret that as their problem to solve, usually by giving you concessions or information you never explicitly requested. Most people fill silence because they think it's their responsibility. They think extended silence means awkwardness that they need to fix. They think staying quiet makes them seem slow or uncertain. So they talk, they fill, they relieve the pressure for everyone. And in doing so, they surrender the strategic advantage that discomfort creates. Here's the ruthless truth. Whoever tolerates discomfort better wins. In negotiations, the person who can sit in uncomfortable silence while the other person squirms extracts better terms. In conflicts, the person who can remain silent while the aggressor escalates and exhausts themselves emerges victorious. In social situations, the person who doesn't feel obligated to fill every silence is perceived as confident, high status, and in control. When you create silence that makes others uncomfortable and refuse to be the one who relieves that discomfort, you force them to make the move, reveal their position, or give concessions to resolve the tension you created without saying a word. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I choose power over passivity. 5. Strategic silence preserves your position. Let me break this down into something concrete. Every word you speak is information. Information can be used against you. Information reveals your position, your priorities, your weaknesses, your strategies. When you're in high-stakes situations, negotiations, conflicts, sensitive social dynamics, every unnecessary word you speak is potential ammunition for your opponent. Strategic silence preserves your position by revealing nothing. Here's what happens when you talk too much. You explain your reasoning. Now they know how to counter it. You reveal your priorities. Now they know what leverage to use. You justify your position. Now they know your insecurities. You share your constraints. Now they know how to box you in. Every word beyond the absolute minimum necessary is a strategic error that weakens your position. Think about legal situations. The first thing any attorney tells you, remain silent. Not because you're guilty, because anything you say can and will be used against you. That same principle applies to every situation where power dynamics exist. In business negotiations, in workplace conflicts, in relationship disputes, the less you say, the less material your opponent has to work with. When someone asks you a question designed to trap you or gather information, when someone probes for your reasoning to find ways to attack it, when someone wants you to justify your position so they can undermine it, strategic silence is your defense. You don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't owe anyone your reasoning. You don't owe anyone information about your position unless giving it serves your strategic interests. Machiavelli once said, "The prince controls not the wise, but the obedient." And verbose people are easy to control because they give you all the information you need to manipulate them. They explain their decision-making process, so you know which emotional buttons to push. They reveal their priorities, so you know what leverage to apply. They justify their boundaries, so you know how to argue them into lowering those boundaries. Silent people are impossible to control because you don't have the information necessary to manipulate them. Most people think explaining themselves makes them understood and respected. Sometimes it does. But in adversarial or competitive situations, it makes you vulnerable. Every justification is a potential attack surface. Every explanation reveals thinking patterns that can be exploited. Every word beyond the necessary minimum is strategic information you're giving away for free. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't need to explain yourself to people who don't respect your decisions anyway. You don't need to justify yourself to people looking for ammunition against you. You don't need to defend your position to people who've already decided to attack it. Strategic silence preserves your power by giving them nothing to work with except the decision itself. Take it or leave it. When you state your position once clearly and then go silent instead of over-explaining, when you make a decision and don't feel compelled to justify it to everyone who questions it, when you set a boundary and don't defend it with paragraphs of reasoning that can be picked apart, you preserve your position by making it non-negotiable through silence rather than vulnerable through explanation. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I choose awareness over virtue. 6. Silence signals high status and confidence. Pay attention to this status dynamic because it's operating in every social interaction, whether you realize it or not. High status people speak less. Low status people speak more. It's not about actual status, wealth, position, title. It's about perceived status based on behavior. And one of the clearest behavioral signals of status is comfort with silence versus compulsion to fill it. Here's what happens in any social situation with a status hierarchy. The low-status person talks more. They fill silence. They explain themselves. They seek approval through verbal engagement. They interpret silence as rejection, so they talk to fix it. The high-status person speaks less. They're comfortable with silence. They don't feel obligated to fill every void. They don't seek approval because they don't need it. Think about meetings. Who talks the most? Usually not the person with the most power. The CEO sits back and listens. The anxious middle manager talks and talks, trying to prove value through verbal contribution. The executive speaks briefly and with impact when they do speak. The underling fills silence with nervous chatter. This isn't coincidence. It's status psychology. When you're constantly talking, constantly explaining, constantly filling silence, you're signaling that you need validation from the group, that you're anxious about how you're perceived. That silence makes you uncomfortable because you interpret it as social rejection. All of these signals communicate low status, insecurity, a need for approval. When you speak briefly and then stop, when you're comfortable with silence after you've made your point, when you don't feel compelled to fill every pause in conversation, you signal the opposite. You communicate that you don't need external validation, that you're secure enough to let your words stand without elaboration. That social approval isn't something you're desperately seeking. And these signals read as high status, confidence, and self-assurance. Machiavelli understood this. Men in general judge more from appearances than from reality. And the appearance of someone comfortable with silence is someone with power. Someone who doesn't need to convince you of anything. Someone whose value isn't dependent on your approval. Someone who's secure in their position. That appearance creates reality. People treat the silent, confident person as if they have power, which gives them actual power. Most people think they need to talk to be valued in social situations. They think silence makes them forgettable or disengaged. So they force conversation. They fill every pause. They share every thought. And by doing this, they position themselves as low-status members of the social hierarchy who need verbal participation to justify their presence. Here's the ruthless truth. The person who speaks least in any group setting is often perceived as having the most power, assuming when they do speak, it's with precision and impact. This isn't about being antisocial or disengaged. It's about understanding that social value isn't measured by word count. It's measured by the weight of the words you choose to speak and the confidence to remain silent when you have nothing to add. When you stop filling every silence in social situations, when you speak briefly and with impact, then remain quiet. When you let others carry conversation while you observe strategically, you signal high status that changes how others perceive and treat you without you having to prove anything through words. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I control my focus. 7. Silence forces others to work for your attention. Here's the final principle that ties everything together. Your attention is valuable. Your response is valuable. Your engagement is valuable. But if you give these things freely to everyone who speaks, they become worthless. Strategic silence makes others work for your attention, your response, your engagement. And that work establishes the power dynamic where you're the prize they're pursuing, not the other way around. Here's what happens when you respond to everything immediately. People learn that getting your attention costs nothing. They can say anything, and you'll engage. They can make demands, and you'll respond. They can interrupt you, and you'll stop what you're doing to address them. You've trained them that your attention is cheap, abundant, and always available. And humans don't value what's cheap, abundant, and always available. Think about text messages. Someone sends you something that doesn't require immediate response. The psychologically weak person responds within minutes because they think immediate response shows they care. The strategic person doesn't respond for hours, maybe a day, not out of spite, but because they understand that immediate availability makes their attention worthless. When you respond strategically after appropriate silence, you communicate that your attention is valuable, selective, and must be earned. In workplace situations, when every person who approaches your desk gets immediate extended attention, you're communicating that interrupting you costs nothing. You're available to everyone for everything at any time. Compare that to the person who acknowledges the interruption, but says, "I'll get to you at 2 p.m. and then returns to their work. The silence, the withholding of immediate engagement, communicates that their time is valuable, and access to it must be on their terms, not yours. When someone disrespects you, and you immediately engage to address it, when someone makes a demand, and you immediately comply or explain why you can't, when someone seeks your opinion, and you immediately offer it, you're teaching them that your attention, your response, your engagement are freely given. Strategic silence teaches the opposite. It teaches that these things are valuable, limited, and conditional. Machiavelli would remind us that he who controls perception controls power. And when you control your silence strategically, you control the perception that your attention is valuable. People start qualifying themselves before approaching you. They start considering whether their request is worth asking. They start valuing the responses you do give, because those responses aren't guaranteed. Most people give their attention freely because they think it makes them approachable, helpful, and valued. Sometimes it does, but often it makes them taken for granted, interrupted constantly, and perceived as low value because they're always available. Strategic silence creates the opposite perception, that your attention is a limited resource that must be earned. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you're always available, always responsive, always engaging with everyone who seeks your attention, you position yourself as someone whose time isn't valuable. When you use strategic silence to make people wait, to make people work for your response, to make people earn your engagement, you position yourself as someone whose attention is a prize worth pursuing. When you don't respond to every message immediately, when you don't engage with every person who demands your attention, when you use silence to establish that your response is conditional and valuable rather than automatic and cheap, you create a power dynamic where others pursue you rather than you being constantly available for pursuit. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I refuse to be psychologically dominated. Master silence or be mastered by those who do. If you don't master strategic silence, someone who has mastered it will control every negotiation you enter, every conflict you face, every social situation you navigate. This isn't a philosophical debate. This is psychological warfare happening in every interaction. People are using silence, consciously or unconsciously, to control you. And if you're not aware, if you're the one who can't tolerate silence, if you're filling every void with desperate words, you're losing. Stop talking when you should be silent. Stop explaining when you should be withholding. Stop filling uncomfortable silence when you should be weaponizing it. Stop responding immediately when strategic delay would serve you better. Stop giving away information through verbal diarrhea when strategic silence would preserve your position. Start using silence after proposals to force others to reveal their position. Start using silence with liars to expose their deception. Start using silence in conflicts to demonstrate psychological dominance. Start using silence to create discomfort that forces others to give you what you want. Start using silence to preserve your strategic position. Start using silence to signal high status. Start using silence to make your attention valuable rather than freely given. Machiavelli understood centuries ago that self-mastery is the foundation of all power, and mastering silence is mastering yourself. Those who control their words control how others perceive them. Those who control when to speak and when to remain silent control every dynamic they enter. Those who weaponize silence rather than fear, it becomes psychologically untouchable. Don't trade power for the illusion that filling silence makes you engaged. Don't sacrifice strategic advantage for the comfort of avoiding awkward pauses. Don't give away information through unnecessary words when silence protects your position. The people worth negotiating with will respect your silence. The people worth conflicting with will be defeated by it. The people worth knowing socially will be attracted to the confidence it signals. The world doesn't reward intelligence. It rewards influence. And influence comes from understanding that silence isn't the absence of power. It's the ultimate expression of it. Every word you speak is a potential vulnerability. Every silence you maintain is strategic protection. Every pause you refuse to fill is pressure you create. Every response you withhold is power you preserve. Machiavelli would remind you that those who master themselves are never mastered by others, and mastering silence is mastering the most powerful weapon in psychological warfare. Not guns, not words, not threats. Silence. Strategic, calculated, weaponized silence that controls negotiations, dominates conflicts, and establishes social hierarchy without you having to prove anything through words. If you remember nothing else from this message, remember this. The first person to speak after a proposal loses. The person who can't tolerate silence surrenders power. The one who fills every void with words is controlled by everyone who has the discipline to remain strategically silent. If this video transformed how you think about silence and power, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to understand that their verbal diarrhea is destroying their influence. And subscribe to this channel, because we're going to keep exposing the dark psychology of dominance that most people are too afraid to discuss. Now, I want you to drop this final affirmation in the comments. I am untouchable in thought. Outthink the crowd. Stand unshaken. Rule yourself. Now stop talking and start dominating.